They marched in perfect silence, shields locked like iron walls, the earth trembling beneath thousands of synchronized footsteps. No shouting, no chaos, only discipline. Then, as a storm of arrows darkened the sky, the soldiers raised their shields in perfect unison, forming an unbreakable shell of bronze and iron. The testudo, the tortoise, a formation so precise it turned men into a moving fortress. For centuries, Rome's enemies looked across the battlefield and saw not an army, but a machine. A machine built on discipline, fear, and the kind of tactics that seemed almost insane, yet brilliant. What if I told you the Roman army didn't just win wars with strength, but with strategy so strange and unexpected that it shocked the ancient world? They used fire and animals as weapons, built entire fortresses overnight, and turned retreat itself into a deadly trap. These weren't just soldiers. They were inventors of war, masters of deception, and architects of victory. Today, we're stepping into the heart of the Roman battlefield to uncover their craziest and most ingenious tactics. The ones that made the Roman Empire unstoppable for nearly 1,000 years. So get ready, because this isn't just history, it's a story of genius, madness, and the art of war perfected. The Roman military machine. Before we dive into the crazy tactics that made Rome legendary, we first need to understand what made the Roman army so different from every other fighting force of its time. The Romans didn't just go to war, they planned war. Every movement, every order, every soldier had a purpose. Their army wasn't just a crowd of warriors, it was an engine of conquest. At the heart of this engine was the Roman legion, around 5,000 men trained to think, move, and fight as one. Each legion was divided into smaller groups called centuries, commanded by centurions, tough veterans who enforced discipline with iron will. Every Roman soldier, known as a legionary, was more than a fighter. He was a builder, an engineer, and a strategist. When not in battle, they constructed roads, bridges, and forts, the very infrastructure that held the empire together. But what truly made them terrifying was their discipline. Unlike most ancient armies that relied on passion or sheer numbers, Roman soldiers trained every single day, drilling formations, perfecting weapon use, and learning to obey orders instantly. If a commander shouted a command, 10,000 men would respond in perfect synchronization. There was no hesitation, no confusion, only precision. It was as if every soldier shared one mind, one heartbeat. And that's where Rome's secret lay: organization. While other armies might break apart when chaos struck, Roman legions adapted. They could fight in deserts, forests, or mountain passes, anywhere, anytime. Each soldier knew his place, his duty, and his commander's next move. This unity allowed them to face enemies far larger than themselves, and still win. Because to Rome, war wasn't just about courage, it was about control. They understood that strategy could defeat strength, and order could conquer chaos. And with that foundation, they began creating tactics so unusual, so daring, that they would shape the future of warfare for thousands of years to come. Next, we'll look at one of their most famous and ingenious formations, the human tank, that could turn men into a wall of steel, the legendary testudo. The testudo formation, the human tank. Imagine standing on a battlefield, facing thousands of Roman soldiers advancing toward you. You fire arrows, sling stones, hurl javelins, but nothing seems to stop them. Because the moment danger rises, they transform. Shields lock together, front to back, side to side, top to bottom, until not a single patch of skin is visible. From a distance, it looks like a giant metal shell slowly rolling across the battlefield. This was the testudo formation, or as the Romans called it, the tortoise. The testudo wasn't just a defensive trick, it was a masterpiece of coordination. Soldiers in the front row held their shields straight ahead, forming a solid wall. Those in the middle raised theirs overhead, creating a protective roof. The men on the sides angled theirs outward to guard the flanks. In seconds, an army that once looked human turned into something mechanical, an indestructible fortress made of flesh and iron. This tactic was especially powerful during sieges. When attacking walled cities, Roman troops had to march through storms of arrows and rocks hurled from above. In testudo, they could advance fearlessly, step by step, until they reached the gates. Under that shell of shields, the soldiers were almost untouchable. What made it so effective wasn't just the shields, it was the discipline behind them. Each soldier had to trust the man beside him completely. If even one shield slipped, the formation could crumble. That level of teamwork required endless training, strength, and mental focus. To enemies, it looked terrifying. To allies, it looked invincible. The sound of shields locking in unison, clack, 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 was enough to send chills down the spine of anyone watching. It's no exaggeration to say that the testudo turned the Roman legion into a living tank, 2,000 years before the invention of the real thing. And yet, this was just one of many ways Rome reinvented the art of war. Because while the testudo protected their bodies, the next tactic we'll explore targeted something far more powerful: the enemy's mind. Divide and conquer, psychological warfare. The Romans didn't just fight battles, they controlled them. They understood something that many of their enemies never did. War wasn't only about swords and spears, it was about the mind. Long before the fighting began, Rome had already started winning through psychological warfare. When Roman legions marched toward an enemy, they wanted to be seen and heard. Imagine tens of thousands of soldiers moving in perfect formation, shields gleaming in the sunlight, banners fluttering, and the thunder of drums echoing across the plains. Their arrival alone could terrify opponents before the first arrow was even fired. They used sound as a weapon. Giant horns known as cornua and to be blasted through the air, signaling commands, but also spreading fear. Enemies who weren't used to such organization mistook the sounds for dark omens or calls of the gods. But Rome's psychological tactics went deeper than intimidation. They used rumors, disinformation, and deception to weaken their foes before a single sword was drawn. Take Julius Caesar, for example. During his campaigns in Gaul, he often spread false reports about the size of his forces or the direction of his march. By the time the enemy realized the truth, it was too late. They were already surrounded. He once ordered his men to build enormous fortifications around an enemy camp, walls, towers, trenches, not just to trap them, but to break their spirit. Imagine waking up and seeing that your enemy had built an entire fortress overnight. It told every soldier inside, "You're trapped. You're already beaten." This was divide and conquer in its purest form, not just separating armies on the battlefield, but breaking their unity, dividing their courage, and conquering their will to fight. Rome's enemies often entered battles angry, loud, and overconfident. But Rome entered calm, quiet, and calculating, and that silence was far more dangerous. Because while others fought with emotion, the Romans fought with precision. And when the mind of the enemy fell, the body soon followed. But Rome didn't stop there. Sometimes they used tactics so wild, so unexpected, that even animals became weapons of war. Up next, the infamous story of flaming pigs versus war elephants. Flaming pigs versus war elephants. Now this next tactic sounds so wild, you might think it came from a movie, but it really happened. In the early days of Rome's wars, they faced a terrifying new weapon: war elephants. Towering beasts clad in armor, carrying soldiers on their backs, charging straight into Roman lines. Horses panicked at the sight of them, men were crushed beneath their feet, and for a time, Rome had no idea how to stop them. But the Romans were nothing if not inventive. They studied, they adapted, and they came up with one of the strangest counterattacks in military history. They took pigs, covered them in pitch and tar, set them on fire, and released them toward the enemy's elephants. It sounds insane, but it worked. The squealing, flaming pigs ran wildly across the battlefield, and the elephants, terrified of the sight and sound, turned and stampeded back into their own ranks, crushing everything in their path. It was cruel, yes, but it was also effective. And it showed something essential about the Roman way of war. They were willing to use anything to win. They learned from every defeat, analyzed every enemy, and turned their opponent's strengths into weaknesses. The flaming pigs weren't just a random act of madness, they were a message. The Romans were saying, "No matter what you bring against us, we will find a way to beat it." And once they learned how to counter the elephants, Rome would never again be caught off guard. But not every crazy tactic relied on animals or fire. Some of Rome's most brilliant moves came from pure deception, from making their enemies believe they were winning, right before they fell into a trap. Let's talk about one of Rome's favorite tricks, the fake retreat. The fake retreat, the trap within the trap. One of the oldest and most dangerous moves in warfare is pretending to run away. Most armies can't pull it off. Fear turns fake retreats into real ones. But the Romans? They perfected it. In the heat of battle, Roman commanders would order their front lines to fall back, slowly, in apparent panic. To the enemy, it looked like the Romans were breaking. Soldiers cheered, dropped their guard, and charged forward to finish the job. But that was exactly what the Romans wanted. As the enemy rushed in, thinking victory was at hand, the Romans suddenly stopped retreating, regrouped in perfect formation, and attacked from both sides. The hunters became the hunted. This tactic was used in several battles, including the Battle of Cynoscephaly in 197 BC, where the Romans faced the Macedonian phalanx, a formation famous for its long spears and deadly discipline. The Romans pretended to withdraw, tricking the phalanx into chasing them across rough ground. Once the formation broke apart, the Romans struck hard, from the front and the flank, wiping out the enemy completely. It was genius because it required absolute control. Every soldier had to know his role, even when pretending to be afraid. The timing had to be perfect. 1 second too soon or too late, and the trap would fail. In modern terms, it was like a chess player sacrificing pieces to lure the opponent into checkmate. The fake retreat proved that the Romans weren't just strong, they were cunning. They understood human nature, and they used it against their enemies at every turn. Because sometimes, the easiest way to win was to let your enemy think he already had. And as clever as this was, it was only one part of a much bigger picture, a system so efficient that Roman soldiers could turn any open field into a fortress in a single night. Up next, the engineering brilliance of the Roman army. Forts in one night, engineering genius. The Roman army didn't just fight battles, they built them. Wherever the legions went, they carried not only weapons but shovels, axes, and an entire toolkit for constructing fortifications. Every evening, no matter where they stopped, in enemy territory, deep in the wilderness, or after a long march, the Romans built a fortified camp from scratch. And not just a few tents behind a fence. These were fully designed mini-fortresses, complete with walls, ditches, gates, and guard towers. It became a ritual. When the order was given to halt, soldiers didn't rest. They immediately began to dig trenches, pile up earth, drive wooden stakes, and mark out streets for tents in perfect grid patterns. Each man knew his exact task, and within hours, what had been open land became a secure Roman stronghold. The Romans called it the castrum, and it was one of the keys to their domination. It gave them safety at night, organization in the morning, and control over the land they occupied. This daily habit served another purpose, too. It kept the soldiers constantly busy, disciplined, and united. There was no time for laziness, fear, or doubt. Even their enemies were astonished. Some ancient historians wrote that Roman soldiers could build a camp faster than others could pitch their tents. Imagine watching 5,000 men move in perfect rhythm, digging, hammering, lifting, until an entire fortress rose out of the earth before your eyes. And when dawn came, they would dismantle it, march onward, and build it again by sunset. This was Rome's secret weapon, not magic, not luck, but organization. They turned the act of making camp into a military tactic, transforming every battlefield into home turf. Their forts symbolized what Rome truly was, order in the middle of chaos. But when it came to large-scale battles, their order and strategy reached legendary levels. The next tactic we'll uncover shows Rome's brilliance in maneuvering thousands of men at once, the double envelopment, a move so deadly it changed the course of history. The double envelopment, the perfect trap. In the chaos of ancient warfare, one tactic stood above all others as the ultimate symbol of strategy and precision, the double envelopment. It's one of the hardest moves to pull off in battle, and yet, when done correctly, it meant total annihilation for the enemy. Imagine this: the enemy army charges forward, smashing into the Roman center. It looks like the Romans are being pushed back, their lines bending under pressure. But that's exactly what they want. Because while the enemy is focused on the center, the Roman wings, the soldiers on the sides, begin to move. Slowly at first, then faster, wrapping around like a closing gate. And before the enemy realizes what's happening, they're surrounded on all sides, trapped in a tightening ring of shields and swords. There's no escape. The army collapses in panic, crushed between the Roman front, flanks, and reserves. This tactic was used against Rome once, by the great Carthaginian general Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. His double envelopment wiped out an entire Roman army of nearly 50,000 men. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. But the Romans learned from it. They studied every detail, how it worked, why it succeeded, and then they perfected it. In later wars, Rome used the same maneuver to destroy its enemies, turning Hannibal's trick into a Roman weapon. The double envelopment became the ultimate proof of Rome's adaptability. They didn't just learn from victories, they learned from disaster. Generals like Scipio Africanus and Julius Caesar mastered this art, using it to crush opponents who outnumbered them 2 or even 3 to 1. It was more than a tactic, it was a statement. Rome was saying to the world, "You can beat us once, but we'll come back smarter." And that attitude, learning, evolving, and perfecting, is exactly why the Roman army survived for centuries when so many others vanished into history. But their discipline didn't come from glory alone. It was built on fear, a fear so intense it forged obedience stronger than steel. Up next, the dark side of Roman discipline, decimation. Decimation, the dark side of discipline. For all their brilliance, precision, and power, the Roman army also had a dark and terrifying side, one that showed just how far Rome would go to maintain control. It was called decimation. The word comes from the Latin decimus, meaning 10th. And it was exactly as brutal as it sounds. When a Roman unit showed cowardice, disobedience, or failed in battle, the punishment wasn't a simple reprimand or loss of pay, it was death. But not for everyone. The soldiers would be divided into groups of 10, and in each group, one man was chosen by lot to die, executed by his own comrades. The chosen soldier would be beaten or stoned to death by the other 9, who were then forced to continue serving, knowing they had killed a brother in arms. This horrifying ritual wasn't used often, but when it was, it sent a clear message: discipline above all. Fear kept the army united, fear kept them strong. Roman commanders like Crassus and even Julius Caesar used decimation when discipline faltered. It was extreme, but in Rome's eyes, necessary. Because in the Roman world, the worst crime wasn't losing a battle, it was disobeying an order. To us, it may seem cruel. But to the Romans, it was the price of survival. Every soldier had to understand that the legion was more important than the individual. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was life or death. And that's why the Roman legions could stand unmoved while facing armies twice their size. Every man knew that breaking formation wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. This ruthless sense of discipline forged the backbone of Rome's military power. It created an army that feared its commanders more than its enemies, and that, ironically, made them unstoppable. Because in the Roman army, there was only one law: obey or perish. But despite their harsh methods, the Romans achieved something extraordinary, a military system so advanced that its strategies still echo in the modern world. Up next, the legacy of Roman tactics, and how the genius of their formations, engineering, and discipline continues to shape warfare even today. Legacy of Roman tactics. Even though the Roman Empire fell more than 1,500 years ago, its military genius never disappeared. In fact, the fingerprints of Rome's tactics are still visible in modern armies, strategies, and even police formations around the world. The idea of organized ranks, drilled formations, and standardized training all began with the Roman legions. Their method of moving as one body, rather than as individuals, became the foundation for every professional army that followed. Their engineering skills revolutionized logistics, the way armies move, supply, and build. modern militaries still study Roman road building, fort construction, and the incredible efficiency of their supply lines. Even their battlefield formations inspired future generations. The shield walls of medieval knights, the disciplined infantry of Napoleon, and the modern riot control lines of police forces all trace their roots back to Roman tactics like the testudo and the phalanx adaptations. But beyond technique, Rome left behind a philosophy that strategy wins wars, not strength alone. The Romans proved that knowledge, adaptability, and discipline could overcome chaos and numbers. Their leaders, men like Scipio, Caesar, and Trajan, weren't just warriors. They were thinkers, planners, and engineers of victory. The Roman army was more than a fighting force. It was a symbol of what human organization and intellect could achieve when pushed to their limits. Even today, military academies across the world still study Roman battles, analyzing how a civilization without modern technology could dominate for centuries through pure strategy and coordination. From their human tanks to their psychological warfare, from their brutal punishments to their brilliant engineering, the legacy of Rome's tactics lives on. Because the Romans didn't just fight wars, they designed them. And that design changed the world forever. The empire built on discipline. As the dust settles and the echoes of marching legions fade into history, one truth remains unshaken. The Roman army was more than just soldiers. It was a machine of empire. From the testudo's unbreakable shell to the terrifying power of decimation, every tactic, every law, and every formation was part of something far greater, a vision of control, unity, and endurance. The Romans didn't rely on luck or divine favor. They built their empire on logic, structure, and absolute discipline. They studied every defeat, learned every lesson, and turned failure into innovation. That's why their empire lasted not decades, but centuries. When most ancient armies vanished after one lost war, Rome returned, stronger, smarter, and more determined. Their legions were feared across continents, their banners recognized by enemies and allies alike. Even when the empire itself eventually crumbled, the idea of Rome, its military order, its strategies, its belief in organization over chaos, lived on. Modern warfare, modern leadership, even modern city planning, all still carry the DNA of Roman discipline. It's said that empires rise and fall, but systems of genius never die. And Rome's system, this blend of intelligence, precision, and ruthless order, remains one of the greatest the world has ever seen. So the next time you hear the word Roman, don't just think of emperors or marble statues. Think of the soldiers, the men who stood shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, facing the impossible, and won. Because they didn't just conquer lands. They conquered time itself.